I want you to imagine just for a second that you're having like the perfect relaxing day out on the water.
Oh, absolutely. The kind of day where the sun is shining, there's a gentle breeze.
Exactly. You're on a stand-up paddleboard, the water is calm, and you're just sort of gliding along.
Sounds ideal.
Right. But after an hour or two, your shoulders are getting a little tired. So you decide it's time to head back to shore.
Make your way back in.
Yeah, you see the beach, and naturally you aim for the shallow water.
Hmm.
I mean, your entire goal right now is to glide in as close to the dry sand as physically possible.
So you don't get your feet wet.
Exactly. You want to gracefully step off the board without getting soaked. It feels like, the most logical, safest thing to do.
It does. It really does.
But here is the terrifying reality we are exploring today. Beneath that shimmering surface, right in that shallow water you are aiming for, you're actually steering your board straight into a hidden, camouflaged field of razor blades.
It's just a phenomenal image to start with, honestly, because it captures exactly why this specific hazard is so incredibly deceptive.
Right.
Every single instinct you have as a human being is telling you that you're doing the safe thing, or you're seeking out the comfortable thing.
Staying out of the deep water.
Exactly. But the environment is actively weaponizing that instinct against you.
Which brings us to the mission for today's deep dive. We're looking at this fascinating safety analysis that details a highly specific hazard on the west coast of South Korea.
Yeah, it's a very unique situation.
We're going to unpack what this underwater hazard actually is, how human psychology ironically draws us right into the danger zone, and this is the craziest part to me, how a microscopic mistake made by one person can snowball into a life-threatening emergency for a total stranger.
That invisible handoff of risk is really the core of this entire phenomenon.
Yeah.
It takes this microscopic physical event and traces its consequences all the way to a major systemic failure.
It's wild.
It is. It ends up being this brilliant case study in human behavior, environmental risk, and basically the domino effect of negligence.
I have to admit, when I first started looking into this, I was just completely baffled. Because stand-up paddleboarding is pretty much the definition of a serene, low-impact activity.
It's basically yoga on water.
Right. So how does a sport this peaceful secretly harbor this intense, extreme sport level of hidden danger? And more importantly, what exactly are these razor blades we're talking about? Because I'm assuming someone didn't just dump a truckload of actual Gillette razors into the ocean.
No, nature built these all on her own.
Heck.
In the local fishing villages along the South Korean coast, they call these formations Gul-pik or Gul-jip, which roughly translates to oyster houses or oyster beds.
Okay, oysters. But when I go to the beach and step on a stray oyster shell in the sand, it might be a little uncomfortable, but it doesn't slice my foot open like a scalpel.
Right, it's just a dull shell.
Yeah. Why are these so dangerous? Is it just because there's so many of them grouped together?
It's partly the grouping, but it's mostly the mechanics of how they grow.
How so?
Well, these aren't just a few stray shells scattered on the sand. These are dense, really aggressive colonies of oyster shells that attach themselves directly to the solid bedrock.
Oh, so they're stuck there.
Completely cemented. And they don't spread out flat. Because they are competing for nutrients in the water, they continuously grow upward, just stacking on top of one another.
So they're basically fighting for space, building these vertical towers of shell.
Exactly. And this upward growth pattern changes the physical structure of the shell edge.
Okay.
The calcified structure of an oyster shell, when it grows in these dense competitive clusters, forms these incredibly sharp ridges.
Wow.
They become as thin as a blade, rough as a saw, and sharply pointed at the tips. The sources actually say that if you run your hand across a Gul-jip, it's literally comparable to touching the cut edge of a rusted iron plate or broken glass.
Oh my gosh. That sounds like stepping on a Lego in the dark, but infinitely worse.
Much worse.
Just a hidden minefield of broken glass. But wait, going back to my normal beach experience, why are the shells we find washed up on the sand so much smoother?
That's a good question.
If oysters naturally grow this sharp, shouldn't every single beach be a massive hazard zone?
That comes down to the physics of mobility versus immobility. Think about the shells you usually find washed up on a sandy beach.
Right.
They've been detached from whatever they were growing on. They've been tumbling in the surf, grinding against sand and other stones for weeks, maybe months or years.
Oh, I see.
The ocean acts like a giant rock tumbler. It takes all those sharp calcified edges and sands them down until they are smooth and rounded.
So the ocean is doing the polishing work for us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But because these Gul-jip colonies are cemented to the bedrock, they never tumble. They just sit there.
They never move.
Right. So their jagged, upward-facing edges are never polished away. They just keep growing sharper and more brittle.
That is terrifying.
You're dealing with stationary, deeply anchored knives pointing directly up at the surface of the water. And to make matters worse, they have a built-in cloaking device.
Wait, cloaking device, you mean the water itself?
Yes. During low tide, when these beds are just barely submerged or freshly exposed, they are coated in wet seawater.
Okay.
So they reflect the sunlight exactly like the surrounding water and the harmless rocks nearby. They camouflage perfectly.
Wow.
If you are looking down from the vantage point of a paddleboard, trying to read the water, they are almost entirely invisible to the naked eye.
So you have a beginner paddleboarder who is already probably a little wobbly,
Definitely wobbly.
looking down at what appears to be a perfectly safe, sandy, rocky bottom, which I guess brings us to the psychology of the crash.
Right.
Because it's one thing for these stationary knives to just exist, but it's another thing for riders to consistently ply right into them.
And this is where we have to look at the mindset of a novice.
Uh.
If you have ever tried a new water sport, you know that deep water triggers a baseline level of anxiety.
Oh, 100%.
Your brain knows you're out of your element. But as you start paddling back toward the land, your mindset shifts completely.
Your guard drops, you see the beach, and your brain says, okay, phew, we made it. The dangerous part is over.
And that is the psychological trap. The beginner's ultimate goal becomes comfort.
Right.
They think, I want to get off this board without getting my feet wet. They fundamentally equate shallow water with safe water.
Which makes sense. I would do the exact same thing. You aim to ride the board in until the very tip of it kisses the sand so you can just, step off onto dry land like you're dismounting a luxury yacht.
But by riding into those extreme shallows, you trigger a highly destructive physical equation.
What do you mean?
You have the weight of the board itself, plus the rider's body weight pushing down, and on top of that, you have the kinetic energy of the waves.
Those are rocket.
The constant rocking, lifting, and dropping motion.
So instead of just gliding over the surface, that wave action is taking the entire combined weight of the rider and the board and violently grinding the bottom of the board directly down into those stationary oyster knives.
It acts like a giant cheese grater on the bottom of the paddleboard.
Yikes.
And this impact and grinding motion causes severe damage to the PVC outer layer of the board. This is particularly devastating for air SUPs, the inflatable paddleboards that most beginners rent.
Because they're basically filled with air.
Because they are incredibly highly pressurized.
Okay, let's stop and talk about the mechanics of that pressure for a second, because my intuition says that if I take a highly pressurized inflatable object, essentially a giant balloon,
Right.
and I slam it down onto a field of stationary razor blades with my full body weight, it should violently pop.
It really should, shouldn't it?
Yeah. There should be a massive theatrical bang that echoes down the beach, warning everyone that a board just got destroyed. Why doesn't that happen?
It's a brilliant question because the lack of an explosion is the most counterintuitive part of this entire hazard.
It doesn't make sense to me.
To understand why it doesn't pop, we have to look at how modern inflatable paddleboards are actually constructed.
Okay.
They are not made of thin, stretchy rubber like a party balloon or a cheap pool float.
Right. If they were, you wouldn't be able to stand on them. They'd just bend in half.
Exactly. To make them rigid enough to support a human standing up, manufacturers use something called drop stitch technology.
Drop stitch.
Inside the board, connecting the top deck to the bottom hull, are tens of thousands of microscopic polyester threads.
Oh, weird. Inside the air chamber.
Yes. When you pump air into the board, often up to 15 or 20 psi, which is comparable to the pressure in a car tire, those thousands of internal threads pull tight.
Ah, so they act like tiny internal pillars holding the shape flat.
They hold massive amounts of tension, so the material itself is highly constrained. It cannot bulge or stretch outward. When the bottom of the board grinds against a razor-sharp oyster shell, the shell doesn't slash a giant gaping hole across the entire hull.
Because the threads are holding it all together.
The tightly woven structure prevents a catastrophic blowout. Instead, the oyster shell acts exactly like a surgical scalpel.
Oh, man.
It slices a micro-puncture, a tiny, nearly invisible pinhole.
Just a microscopic nick in the armor. So the air doesn't rush out all at once because the structural integrity of the board is still mostly intact.
Right. Instead of an explosive bang, it creates a slow, agonizingly quiet leak.
Just a hiss.
A hiss so subtle that you could never hear it over the sound of splashing water, the wind, and the crashing waves.
Which, paradoxically, makes this situation infinitely more dangerous than if it had just exploded on the rocks.
Absolutely.
I mean, if it pops, your day is ruined, you might get a bruise, but you're standing in 6 inches of water. You just walk back to the rental shack.
You're safe.
But a silent leak creates a ticking time bomb.
And this transitions us from a physical hazard to a psychological one. This is the next rider domino effect.
Domino effect, yeah.
We're looking at a scenario where one person's tiny, completely ignored mistake silently transfers a massive survival risk to a total stranger.
Okay, let's walk through how this happens.
Sure.
The current rider, the one who just ground the board over the oyster beds to keep their feet dry, steps onto the beach. Because the board didn't explode, they might look down and notice the board feels a little squishy.
Right. They might think, it feels a bit soft.
But human nature kicks in.
They rationalize it immediately. They tell themselves, I guess the air contracted because the water was cold, or it probably just lost a little air in the hot sun.
Or honestly, they just don't care.
That too.
Their rental hours up, they're tired, and they certainly don't want to lose their security deposit by admitting they might have dragged the board over some rocks.
Nobody wants to pay a fine.
Right. So they just hand the paddle back, say thanks, had a great time, and walk away.
The critical failure happens in that exact moment of silence. By failing to report the potential damage, they are handing a compromised piece of life-saving equipment back into circulation.
That is exactly like returning a rented scuba tank after you accidentally smashed it against a rock.
Yes.
You don't realize you slightly bent the air valve, and because you don't say anything, the next person takes that damaged tank down to 60 feet.
It's terrifying.
You are effectively setting a deadly booby trap out of pure negligence.
It's a terrifying handoff. Think about the person who rents that board next. They have absolutely no idea what happened an hour ago.
Right.
Let's say this next rider is a bit more experienced. They decide to take that damaged board on a long-distance tour out into the open ocean. Or maybe the wind starts picking up and blowing offshore.
And all the while, that micropuncture is quietly hissing.
Over the course of an hour or two, the internal pressure of that board is steadily dropping. And as we discussed with the drop stitch core, pressure is everything for an inflatable paddleboard. It is the only thing giving the board its rigidity, its buoyancy, and its stability.
If you've ever tried to stand up on a half-inflated air mattress in a swimming pool, you know exactly what happens next.
It's impossible. The board begins to bend in the middle. It sags like a taco.
Like a taco, yeah.
The rider suddenly experiences a total collapse in their balance.
Oh.
The board loses its restoring force in the waves, meaning every tiny ripple, every shift in weight threatens to violently throw them into the water.
And now they're a mile out from shore.
Exactly.
Their legs turn to jelly trying to balance on this failing platform. What started as a minor, unreported gear issue in the shallow water has now metastasized into a severe survival situation.
A total nightmare.
They're facing exhaustion, the onset of hypothermia in cold water, the very real risk of drowning, and the necessity of a full-blown marine rescue.
All because someone earlier that afternoon wanted to keep their ankles dry and felt too embarrassed to mention a tiny scrape on the bottom of the board.
It is infuriating, and it proves that this microscopic danger doesn't just exist in a vacuum. There's a reason we are focusing specifically on South Korea's west coast today, right?
Yes.
This chain reaction requires a very specific environment to thrive.
It really is a geographical perfect storm. If you look at the geography of South Korea, the East Coast and the West Coast are fundamentally different.
Okay.
The West Coast is defined by massive tidal differences.
Yeah.
Huge, sweeping swings between high and low tide.
Which creates these vast, sprawling mudflats.
Right.
And it exposes enormous colonies of oysters and barnacles that would normally stay hidden underwater.
Exactly. Areas like Malipo, Kiolipo, and Hakampo feature a deadly, highly specific combination for paddleboarders, exposed bedrock, aggressively growing oyster beds, and extremely shallow water that stretches out for a very long distance during low tide.
That long stretch of shallow water is the bait.
It really is.
It tempts the beginners to ride their boards hundreds of yards in, thinking they're safely gliding over a smooth, sandy bottom, when in reality they're navigating a submerged, razor-sharp reef.
A hidden minefield.
So how do rental operators and clubs even begin to fight back against this? I mean, you're fighting geology and you're fighting basic human psychology.
It's incredibly tough. The physical solution they have to implement is absolute, but it is highly counterintuitive.
What's the rule?
The golden rule operators try to enforce is that you must never, under any circumstances, ride the board all the way to the sand.
Oh, wow.
A rider must dismount in knee-deep water, step down into the ocean, and physically lift the board out of the water to carry it the rest of the way to shore.
I love the irony here.
It's backwards, right?
In almost every other scenario in life, we view the deep water as the dangerous part. The ocean is scary, the land is safe.
Right.
But in this specific environment, the water is actually the protective cushion for the equipment, and the solid ground is the active threat.
It's a complete role reversal. And retraining beginners to gladly step down into cold, knee-deep water instead of gliding safely onto the beach, it's incredibly difficult.
Oh, I bet. People want to stay dry.
Exactly. Education alone isn't enough to override that instinct. So operators have to implement rigid, fail-safe protocols. They rely on a robust system of pre-checks and post-checks.
So what does a post-check even look like in this scenario? I'm picturing a mechanic looking for a tire leak. Are the operators like wiping the bottom of the paddleboards down with soapy water to look for bubbles?
In many cases, yes, that is exactly what they have to do.
Wait, really?
Oh, yeah. When a board comes back, the operator cannot just toss it in the pile for the next customer. They have to meticulously inspect the board's internal pressure with a gauge.
Wow.
They have to physically run their hands over the bottom hull, feeling for scratches, inspect the fin boxes, and specifically hunt for those silent microscopic air leaks using soap and water.
It's like performing a mandatory pre-flight inspection on an aircraft. You basically have to assume there's hidden damage.
Because the alternative is trusting the silence of a slow leak, which we know is deadly.
Right.
What this ultimately boils down to is that safety in this environment isn't just a matter of steering around rocks. It demands a complete cultural shift.
A shift from individual convenience to shared responsibility.
Exactly. It's about building a community where equipment checks aren't seen as a tedious chore, and reporting a scrape on a rental board isn't something you hide out of shame or, fear of a fine.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The culture has to evolve so that walking up to an operator and saying, "Hey, I think I scraped the bottom on the way in, can we check the pressure?" is viewed as an act of protecting your fellow paddlers.
It reframes reporting damage from being a mistake that gets punished to being a celebrated act of community safety. That is incredibly powerful.
It really is.
Let's take a step back and look at the journey we've been on today.
Okay.
We started by diving into the unique, challenging marine environment of South Korea's west coast.
Specifically focusing on the Gul-jip. These incredibly dense, razor-sharp oyster beds that grow upwards like stationary knives cemented to the bedrock.
And from there, we unpacked the dark irony of beginner psychology. We saw how the very human instinct to stay dry and seek out the comfort of shallow water is exactly what drives paddlers to grind their highly pressurized inflatable boards right across those invisible blades.
Then we explored the fascinating mechanics of the drop-stitch core, learning why these highly pressurized boards don't violently explode when they hit those blades.
Right, no big bang.
Just microscopic pinholes, a silent hissing threat.
Which led us to the most crucial, terrifying takeaway, which is the domino effect. Because that tiny damage is so easily ignored or rationalized by the person who caused it, the risk gets seamlessly passed on to the next unsuspecting rider, turning a relaxing afternoon into a life-threatening marine rescue situation as the board slowly sags and collapses miles from shore. And finally, we saw how operators in high-risk areas like Malipo are fighting back. Not just by forcing people to dismount in knee-deep water, but by trying to engineer a fundamental cultural shift toward rigorous post-checks and a shared communal responsibility for the gear.
It's an accumulation of ignored microfailures that leads to a macro disaster.
It really is. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a thought that branches out from this paddleboarding scenario into a much broader question about how we live today.
Okay.
We just spent this time talking about how the anonymity of renting a paddleboard allows a person to easily ignore the damage they cause, passing a catastrophic risk onto a total stranger. It's a textbook example of the tragedy of the commons.
The idea that when nobody owns a resource, nobody takes true responsibility for it.
Exactly. And we live in an era increasingly defined by the sharing economy. We rent electric scooters and leave them blocking sidewalks. We use shared cars, shared workspaces, shared equipment.
Yeah, we do.
So I want you to mull this over. Does the modern convenience of renting, rather than owning, secretly strip away our fundamental empathy for the people around us? If an anonymous sharing system like a paddleboard rental can become deadly simply because people are too embarrassed to admit a mistake, are these modern sharing economies fundamentally doomed to fail unless we can somehow engineer a culture of radical honesty?